My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Melanie Trecek-King. Melanie is a speaker, writer, educator, and consultant specializing in critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy. She is the creator of Thinking is Power, a twist on the phrase knowledge is power, which empowers individuals with skills to make better decisions and protect themselves from misinformation. She teaches an award-winning general education science course and is a fellow at the Committee of Skeptical Inquiry. My conversation with Melanie today is focused on critical thinking, what it is, how we can use it, and some of the challenges associated with not being an expert in everything. We discuss how people internalize beliefs, how beliefs can be a part of one identity, the politicization of issues, and much, much more. It is with great pleasure I bring you my conversation with Melanie Trecek-King. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Melanie Trecek-King, thank you for taking the time and speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
I am so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I want to talk to you about something that's very important to me and also to the Centre for Inquiry Canada. It's critical thinking, and that's one of the four pillars on which our organization stands. The others being secularism, which is my area of expertise, human rights, and scientific literacy. And I do want to talk about critical thinking, but before we get into that, can you start us off by defining what critical thinking is? And what I hear from a lot of people is that it's just about just what it says. It's about being critical. It's thinking about how to be critical. And it's like the caricature of a skeptic that attacks everything but accepts nothing. So is that what critical thinking is? And if so, please tell me. And if it's not, can you correct whatever's wrong with that proposed definition?
Yeah, you started with an easy question, I see. Defining critical thinking. It's so fun. Like, I'll get in a room of educators and I'll say, do you teach critical thinking? Everybody goes, yes. Okay, what is critical thinking? It's one of those things that everybody seems to talk about and think is a good thing, except for maybe the definition you just mentioned. But it's one that we don't tend to recognize what it is that we're talking about. I actually am I have an article coming out in the next Skeptical Inquirer, and I'm really excited about it, where I explored this very question. Because in education circles, there is a lot of pushback on when we talk about, as skeptics, when we talk about teaching critical thinking, and they will say, well, we do teach critical thinking. And they're not wrong in that one of the major definitions of critical thinking is essentially problem solving. So it is being able to think through an issue, to evaluate the evidence, to analyze it, and come to a reasonable conclusion. And that is certainly an important skill. But the problem with that is that we're limited to the areas in which we have deep expertise. And in
Right.
the real
So if
world,
I know nothing about cars and there's a rattling noise in the engine, I don't have the domain knowledge to actually diagnose and correct it.
yeah, I mean, that would certainly be true for me. And I suppose it would theoretically be possible for me to gain that knowledge and be able to think through it. But that's a lot of time and effort into
Right.
something I don't really care about.
We can always learn, we can gain the knowledge, but that takes time and effort. You don't have it out of the starting gate.
Right. Which is why the definition that I'm proposing that we talk about more and teach is what I'm broadly calling better thinking. It
Okay.
is a recognition of what you know and what you don't know, being able to find reliable knowledge, either in experts or in reliable sources of information, having the curiosity to want to know what is true, being That humility piece is just so important, because if you don't know what you don't know, then you could convince yourself that you're coming to a reasonable conclusion. But here's the problem. If I go online, I mean, something like cars is not necessarily so politicized, but if I want to learn about cars and I go online and I search for things, if I'm not careful, I'm going to end up in a source that's not reliable. And then I'm going to use my critical thinking skills, my problem solving skills. Um, I'm going to base them on unreliable information. And because it's not my area of expertise, I don't necessarily know the difference.
Right.
So I need to know for myself, what are my biases? What are my emotions? Like, am I triggered by this? Um, do I have an identity need involved in this? What kinds of things could be driving my reasoning? The point is, if we understand our thinking better, know what we know and don't know what might be driving our reasoning, being curious and skeptical and humble, then we stand a better chance of finding reliable information and getting to a better conclusion, even if we didn't problem solve our own way through that information.
All right. I want to delve into that first area that you identified, that of finding reliable information. That to use the term that gets bandied about a lot, epistemology. How do we know what we know? And it can be very difficult to find reliable information, not because it doesn't exist, but because how am I as a non expert to determine what information is reliable versus the vast swaths of information that's out there that are unreliable, people that are trying to sell me something, or people trying to convince me of something, rather than people who are just trying to give as unbiased and accurate information as humanly possible. And those people exist too. But everyone, all of these people, the people trying to sell you something, trying to convince you something, trying to be honest with you, they'll all say, I'm the honest one. You should trust me. The scientific data all backs up my position. And as someone from the outside, it can be very difficult to distinguish between the hucksters, the salesperson, the con artists, and the honest folks. So let's delve a little deeper into how can we reliably go about finding reliable information on which to base everything else that we think about.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I actually start. So my background is that I teach. I teach at a college, and I specialize in teaching courses for people who don't want to be scientists when they grow up.
Mm-hmm.
So I was teaching like intro bio, and I love intro bio. I'm a biologist, but I was teaching students about things that they were going to forget. They could look up if they needed to. And I wasn't teaching them the difference between misinformation and reliable information. So then, if they were to later go online and try to find information, if I didn't teach them the difference, I mean, the guardrails are off once you leave a classroom. And so you're going to go on your phone and you're going to look for something, and your biases are probably going to lead you to the information that confirmed what you already wanted to be true. So um, I altered the course to teach critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy. And I start class with exactly what it is that you're talking about. First, epistemology, an understanding of what we know and how reliable knowledge is produced. But importantly, I start with witches, with witchcraft. So, very first day of class, I lecture students about. Say, I'm going to tell you a story, and I just put your pen down. And I just want you to listen, and we'll talk later about what the purpose of this was.
All
But we
right.
talked about the history of the witchcraft hysteria and the witch trials in Europe through like the 15th through the 17th centuries, and the kinds of things people were accused of, and the kinds of things that they confessed to. And that confession was basically the most reliable form of evidence to them. And so they murdered hundreds of thousands of people, mostly women, because they really firmly believed that these women were causing storms that killed crops or birth defects or any number of things. But here's the thing, my students don't generally believe in witchcraft, at least not that form of witchcraft, if some of them do. So they can take a bird's eye view, like stand back and evaluate their thought processes, evaluate what they think they thought they knew and why they thought they knew that. Now, my goal is to get them to internalize it on themselves. But we tend to hold our beliefs pretty tightly, especially ones that are very important to us. And so, by giving them something that's non-triggering, I'm hopefully teaching them how we come to our beliefs and how we justify our beliefs to ourselves, and then how once we have those beliefs, we find evidence to continually support them. And so, after students start to realize that, well, though that was not good evidence, they were really sure, but that wasn't good evidence, and then they start to internalize it on themselves. Now we can start talking about what reliable information, reliable knowledge production looks like. I mean, you talked about scientific literacy being one of the pillars. Yes, science is a more reliable way of knowing, partly because we recognize our own limitations and we are able to, we as a community, collect and evaluate and analyze and vet that evidence. Um, so when my students later need to find reliable information, they recognize their own limitations, their own motivations, and then hopefully will help them find sources of information that are more reliable. You're right, there are reliable sources of information, and part of the problem is we're so like skeptical and cynical. I don't want to say skeptical that way, I apologize. We're so cynical that we just think that everybody's as biased as we are, or everybody is equally biased. And that is not true. There are sources of information that are more reliable. So, on my students, I joke, are captive in that they're with me for 4 months and they want a grade. This process is much easier when I can walk them through these steps, right? Build them, tear them down, build them back up again. In the real world, that's a whole lot more difficult because it takes a lot of time and energy for us to recognize our own thought processes and how we come to believe things and start to realize that we may not know what we think we know, and that there are reliable sources of information. If I might, one more thing, because I'm rambling, but this is so important. Those kinds of issues that tend to have a lot of misinformation are the ones that are really politicized. So in science, it's things like climate change, evolution, GMOs, vaccines, and if we don't recognize our our own motivations and why we might fall for misinformation, then understanding how the misinformation works is insufficient. In that, if we want to find good information, it's not enough to know about the reliable sources of information. We also have to know our own vulnerabilities and why we might fall for them.
Right. And that can be very challenging because there isn't necessarily a list. Like, as someone who's a non-believer, I don't believe in saints. I believe in human fallibility, and that everyone is prone to making mistakes, and sometimes even behaving in craven ways. Even the best of us are not perfect moral exemplars. But that causes that causes a problem when I'm looking for uh, people whose opinions I can trust, or whose thoughts, or whose claims I can take on trust. Like, I know a few things about a few things, but I don't know a lot, so I have to take it on trust that the water in my tap is going to be safe to drink, because I don't have the expertise to know about to do the research on, well, how clean is the water at the source? What is the process by which they clean it and make it suitable for human consumption? How is it transported to my house, and is it contaminated at any point along the way, or should I just buy bottled water? Um, but maybe I have a particular interest and I develop that expertise. Well, that's great. But then if I want to buy a car, I don't have the time because I've spent all of my time learning about water. I'm not going to have the time to do all of the research to know what is the safest, best value for money, least carbon polluting vehicle that I can buy over the whole life cycle. I'm going to have to find someone that I can trust. So there's only so many hours in the day. There's only so much brain power that I can devote to things that are not, to any given decision that I make. Otherwise, I won't make any decisions. So, given that I have to trust somebody somewhere along the line, I don't have an infinite amount of time to validate everything from first principles. And given that everybody is fallible, at least at some point, how can we go about making even reasonable decisions when everything on which we base our decisions is suspect, or at least susceptible to falsification being proven wrong?
Yeah, that trust issue is so foundational. I don't think a lot of people are aware of just how much they think they know is based on trust. And so that's that intellectual humility piece again, recognizing what it is that you think you know and what you don't know. Um, a few years ago, was it post truth was one of the words of the year. And um, while I think that's pretty telling that we're talking about a post truth era, I actually think the problem is post trust. It's not, we do, I think, care about what's true. The problem is that we're not trusting the right sources of information. So, especially in times where there's a lot of confusion, there's people are anxious and afraid. Um, it's so much easier to retreat into our tribe and what it is that they tell us is true. Now, the problem is that, not everything I believe is true. I wish I knew what I believed that wasn't true, but I don't know. Um,
Well, you've got a wide set of beliefs, and you've deeply researched some of them, and some of them you've just adopted because people you respect
mhm,
have adopted that belief. They are a recognized expert, perhaps, in those things, or maybe they're just charismatic and you like them, and you've just adopted their,
mhm.
what they say because they're in a position of authority, or you like them, and so you want to believe as they do. But do you remember all the beliefs that you've brought in, that you've deeply researched, and which ones you've brought in because someone who sounded like they knew what they were talking about said it? Like, do you keep track? Is that possible for a person to do?
No, Van Orman Quine has this wonderful idea of the web of beliefs. So if you imagine in your head, you've got beliefs that form like a web, and they're
Mm-hmm.
all connected to each other in sort of concentric circles in a very simplified form. But at the very center are those that are the most important to us. So they're the really identity defining beliefs, but everything is attached to them in some various way. And when we evaluate new information, what happens is it has to fit in that web. If it doesn't fit in the web, then we discard it as obviously not true because it doesn't fit with how we see the world. But those beliefs themselves have largely come from two sources, our personal experiences and received wisdom. So we trust what we experience. Like, I've heard people say, I know aliens are real because I've seen a UFO, right? Or I know homeopathy works because I tried it and I felt better. So we
Right.
trust our experiences, but then we also trust certain people. Like you said, we trust people in our tribe. We trust people who are seemingly authorities. Maybe they're just charismatic. Maybe they're just telling us what we already want to believe. Nevertheless, that is the stuff that then gets in and has to fit with the web. So if you're ever talking to somebody who is clearly wrong about something, that one node is part of a bigger web. Like you can't pick it apart and expect them to go, oh, you know what, that you're right, that belief is wrong, because it fits with how they overall see the world. And so we need to remember ourselves then when we're evaluating information or experts that we're not doing the same thing. And it's incredibly difficult to do because we don't, like you said, we don't have time to evaluate all of our beliefs. I do think it matters, though, for us to remember the role of trust when it comes to belief formation, and to make sure that we're trusting reliable sources of information, in that we're trusting the process that various fields use to arrive at knowledge, as opposed to that seems true because I want to believe it, or because my biases tell me it's true. So, placing trust wisely.
Okay, so that's a big challenge. Another challenge is even all those things that we look up for ourselves. I was talking about looking up things on cars or water safety, uh, but I don't have any formal training in engineering. I don't have any form. I have zero real knowledge of hydrology. Uh, but essentially, what I have been talking about for at least those narrow areas where I talk about developing an expertise is a variation on do your own research, which on its face is something that I think is great. Like, go into a subject area that you don't know a lot about, and find out about it and become, if not an expert, at least conversant in some area of human endeavor. And I see that phrase a lot online. You should do your own research, and that's appealing to me because otherwise, if you don't do at least some form of personal verification, then you're taking someone's word for it, and you're not investigating, learning. You're not drawing your own independent conclusions. So don't we should maybe we should encourage people to do their own research, so that they don't fall for the argument from authority. Well, I have this title after my name, I have this job, I have this degree, therefore I must be right, and you don't know anything. But I noticed that you wrote an essay that basically is completely contrary to everything I just said, and that this whole idea that you should do your own research is rather wrong-headed. So I think I'm being perfectly reasonable here, but you don't. So, Melanie, where have I gone wrong?
Yeah, I wrote that first. I'm assuming you're talking about the problem with doing your own research.
Yes.
So, because this was going around, and the thing is, when we're talking about the doing your own research, back to the motivation, that's usually coming from, I don't think the experts are right in this area. So I'm going to do my own research to show why they're wrong, or why what I believe is true. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes we just want good information, and that is
Mhm.
obviously commendable. But a lot of times when people talk about doing your own research, it comes from this, like, either belief in pseudoscience, or science denial, or conspiratorial beliefs. Um, and the thing is, it takes expertise to recognize where experts are wrong. Um, and the intellectual humility piece again, oftentimes when I'm talking to people who think they can do their own research on some of these topics, they don't know what they think they know. Um, Now, I'm not saying they're not capable of learning those things, right? My point is, experts probably know much more than you think that they do. If I just tell a funny story here,
Sure.
somebody on Twitter was talking about this, and how, I think it was around vaccines, and how, um, like, we just needed, people would have failed Bio 101. And so I posted this really brief, like, quiz. All right, Bio 101. What is the final electron acceptor in cellular respiration? And what is the, like, I had 5 really basic questions. And they said, well, I don't think you understand what Bio 101 is. And I said, I teach Bio 101. Those are literally questions from the final exam. So I think
That's like
it's
on Twitter, I keep seeing things like, "Oh, obviously you didn't read the article," and then the response to that is, "I wrote the article."
yes.
That's,
I feel that so deeply. Um, so that's a lot of stuff that I see. Now, here's the thing. I did write that essay because it was a frustration from that. And it was a plea for people to understand what it is that they probably don't know, and to recognize when they're entering an information ecosystem trying to find information, trying to do their own research, if they're not aware of their own motivations and limitations, then they're just going to find evidence that confirms that they're right and that all of the experts are wrong.
Okay.
Occam's razor would suggest that they're the one who probably just does not know enough.
Right. I want to give you two examples from, fairly recent years. If we go back maybe 5 or maybe 10 years, and the people were being prescribed opioids, in huge quantities,
Mhm.
because the expert consensus was that opioids are safe. All of the testimony was that it was very effective at pain relief, and the research that was published at the time, if you went with the expert consensus, was that they were not addictive. It got embedded into medical institutions to the point where pain was the sixth vital health sign, and taught a whole generation of med students that now doctors were taught on this. And people that were skeptical about having taking opioids in the quantities in which they were being prescribed by their doctor would be like opioid deniers, and they just want people to be in pain. But ultimately, these opioid deniers, or these skeptics, were right. I mean, Purdue Pharma produced completely fraudulent research, but that it's caused an epidemic of addiction from which we as a society are still suffering. On the other side, we have the COVID pandemic, and vaccines that were developed in record time, like half the time of the previous record for any kind of vaccine. And all of the research and observation is that they are A, incredibly effective, and B, overwhelmingly safe. And yet we also have the people who say that they are terrible, awful things. They have all these terrible side effects. We have the vaccine deniers, or the COVID denialists. In one case, I think history has borne out that the skeptics or the denialists were correct in the case of opioids, and I'm fairly sure that history will show that the COVID vaccine denialists or the COVID vaccine skeptics will be proven wrong. But in the heat of it, like in the moment, how can you tell if someone is being appropriately skeptical or
Mm.
inappropriately denialist? And when is it a good idea to question the consensus of experts, which is essential if we're going to make progress, because even a collection of experts isn't always going to be right? And when do we trust the experts so that we can proceed and actually, in the example I just used, inoculate our population against a deadly, and if not deadly, then debilitating disease?
You ask really easy questions.
If I ask the hard ones, you might get stumped, and I want to continue the conversation.
Ah, actually, there were aspects of the opioid story that I hadn't heard before. For example, I guess I'm not sure what the strength of the consensus was that opioids were safe and non-addictive. Anyway, not to question what it is that you say, I'm just saying like these are things that I wasn't necessarily aware of. And as a science communicator, though, I hear aspects of what it is that you just asked. So, a consensus, first of all, is thought of in a couple of different ways. There's a consensus of experts, and there's a consensus of evidence. Hopefully, they're the same, right? So, hopefully, the evidence points to one thing, and the experts are also in agreement. Um, it can be difficult to know what the consensus is, actually. So, after I wrote that first article on the problems of doing your own research, I realized people actually just wanted good information, and that is absolutely valid. So, if you want good information, then how to actually do your own research. So, part two of that is how to find the consensus, if there is one. That said, one of the things that I hear a lot from people online is about the consensus being about just an appeal to authority. Um, which it is not. So if we're talking about the expert consensus aspect of consensus, um, experts are not the same as authorities. So an authority will say this is true because of who I am, versus experts will base their conclusion on evidence. Um, and they will also say, well, the experts have been wrong before, and they're not wrong, right? So experts have been wrong before, and they will continue to be wrong. Even our evidence at this point may point to something that is not true, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong now. And so, if you want to know at any given moment the best knowledge available to humanity, it is the consensus. Again, it could be wrong, but it's probably going to be an expert who finds what's wrong. It's not going to be somebody who is just skeptical because of various reasons. So, it's a hard thing to do in the moment because you've got a new virus, a new vaccine. And in the process of the newness, you've got new evidence and studies pointing in a million different directions. And you're trying to figure out what's happening. And then when the studies and evidence start to coalesce and expert opinion starts to coalesce, that's when you can start to have a bit more, you can be more certain in what the experts and evidence are saying. I really caution people against, though, I hear a lot of, well, Galileo or experts have been wrong or the consensus has been wrong, because that is all true. But if the experts and evidence at the current moment are all pointing in a certain direction, there's really not any better that we can do. So recognize our limitations, recognize their limitations, and realize that what we know can change.
Okay, that's a good answer. Thank you. Um, I want to talk about motivated reasoning because we come to that, and a lot of the counter arguments to what you just said basically boil down to that. Like, scientists are on the take, and there's evidence for that in the past. We had you might remember, or your parents might remember, 9 out of 10 doctors recommend the smooth taste of Camel cigarettes.
Mhm.
Um, and there are climate scientists, not many, but a few that have the right credentials that argue that climate change is, exaggerated, or that what we're doing to try and address it is a misallocation of resources. Um, we do have large corporations that um, uh, argue in their own interest. I'll give a few examples. Like we throw around the term conspiracy theorist a lot in public discourse, but we live in a world where there really are conspiracies. Like there were, like, tobacco companies really did deliberately muddy the waters on the harms that their product made, 50, 60, 70 years ago. Go back 40 years, and energy companies really did understand that burning coal, gas, and oil would change the climate of the earth and heat the planet, and we're living with the consequences of that now. Purdue Pharma really did falsify its research to minimize the findings of addiction. Boeing really did cut corners on safety until its planes fell out of the sky. So we live in a world where conspiracies of large organizations, and to say nothing of government cover-ups of bad behaviors all over the place, so where so many conspiracies really are real, why isn't it rational to be a paranoid conspiracy theorist? Why don't we just assume, just before we get to the evidence and the arguments, why isn't it rational to just take the assumption, to start out on the basis uh, that government and large corporations are the worst possible entities, with acting in the worst possible way with the worst possible motivations? How do we get out of this like logical, rational nihilism given this evidence? And why is, in this case, conspiracy theory an epithet and something that we use to dismiss somebody's arguments rather than saying, oh, well, maybe they're onto something here?
Yeah. Oh gosh. So nihilism and cynicism are they can really feel empowering, um, but they can lead us astray because there is good information, and we want to make sure that we are open to it. Conspiracies are there. There are real conspiracies, right? Um, but we know about those conspiracies because of evidence, because of critical thinking. Conspiratorial thinking, which is a motivation, it's motivated reasoning, um, driven by usually vested interests, solution aversion, identity needs. But it's a driven process to constantly find evidence or excuse away evidence to maintain a conspiracy. So when we talk about conspiratorial thinking, that is the process as opposed to critical thinking. If we want to find, the bottom line here is we want to find critical conspiracy theories, we have to use critical thinking.
Right.
You mentioned there, sorry, go ahead.
I'm agreeing with you, but what I'm hoping you're getting to is how we can um, use the tools of critical thinking to determine the difference between uncovering a real conspiracy,
Mm.
because they do exist in the world, and where someone has come up with an idea that might superficially be plausible but isn't actually true, because there's a lot more conspiracy theories out there than there are conspiracies, but some of them are true. So how do we can't just because someone is positing a conspiracy doesn't mean it's false. So we can't dismiss it out of hand. So how do we distinguish between the two?
Yeah, I think one of the things is that recognizing the role conspiratorial thinking plays in various types of mis and disinformation. So, fake news, I'm air quoting here because that term is kind of meaningless, but
It
there's
just means that you're saying something that I don't agree with. It paints me in a bad light. So that's what it has come to mean,
that's
unfortunately.
exactly true. But also, pseudoscience and science denial at their roots are conspiracy theories. In that, the only way to explain why the vast majority of the world's experts and evidence doesn't agree with your position is that it's a conspiracy. So part of the problem, part of what we need to do here is recognize the role of conspiratorial thinking in science denial and pseudoscience. You mentioned a couple of examples of well documented industry funded denial campaigns. So science denial can be summarized by the acronym FLICC. So fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. So if I want to convince you that, let's say that I own a cigarette company and I know that tobacco smoking is not good for you, because that's what the evidence and consensus points to. Uh, but I don't want the government to regulate my products.
Mm-hmm.
I now have to put out disinformation. Now, people know, they recognize that science is reliable, which is why we often see disinformation and misinformation dressed up like science. Research shows, the evidence says, science says, right?
Right.
Or
Every
even
creationist I've ever engaged with has said a genuine scientist, if you actually follow the evidence, it points to a divine creator of all life on earth.
exactly. But they will also say, why do the other ones disagree? Well, because they're lying, it's a conspiracy. Right. So what we need to do is understand the difference. Now, there's a difference between a denial campaign and those who fall for it. But if we're back to like the tobacco companies,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want you to regulate my product. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dress up people like scientists. I'm going to maybe pay a doctor. I'm going to put somebody in a lab coat, and I'm going to say, doctors say that this one is the best for you. And I'm going to tell you impossible expectations. I'm going to tell you that we don't really know enough about the health impacts of tobacco to regulate. I mean, some of the evidence says this, but some of the evidence says this. And I'm going to cherry pick little bits of evidence that points to that it not really being that bad or maybe even good for you. And then I'm going to say that everybody else is conspiring. So those are the campaigns. Now, for the rest of us who are trying to sort out this information, I really cannot find a better way to sort this out than truly independent thinking. I hear a lot of people using this word independent thinking, but to me, this means no one can do this for you. We need to realize why we might be prone to that kind of misinformation. So maybe I like to smoke cigarettes and I really don't want to own up to the fact that they're not good for me. Or maybe I don't like government regulation. And so I'm going to oppose anything that requires government regulation. Or maybe my tribe has collectively decided that, smoking cigarettes is great. And so I'm going to, that's what the fossil fuel industry did. At this point, the biggest predictor demographically of denial of climate change in the US is conservative. It's become part of an identity.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't want to fall for that kind of misinformation, we need to realize that we might be fooling ourselves. We might be falling for it because of our own vulnerabilities. And don't use conspiracy theory as a cop out for when the evidence doesn't point your way. Right? Don't cry wolf. Only use conspiracy theory when you actually have evidence to point to a real conspiracy.
But when there is conflicting evidence, it can be difficult for the outsider, for the non-expert, to appropriately weigh. Like one study might be more convincing because of better methodology or a larger sample size, or the analysis might be more valid. But from an outside perspective, you get one study that says one thing, another study that says another thing. In a way, it's kind of natural to just say, like, well, we just don't know enough at this point.
Well, I wish more people would say that. We don't know enough at this point, as opposed to using it as an excuse to believe one thing or another. That this single study syndrome is really a problem. You can find a single scientific study that basically says nearly anything.
Right.
As a science educator, I run into a lot of science literacy to a lot of educators means having students read primary literature. Now, I think that's important, right? But you have to be an expert in a field to be able to understand that literature. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
have to have the background knowledge. You have to know the methodology in that field, the kinds of statistical analyses that are done. You have to be able to place that study into the bigger picture, which is why when we start talking about a consensus, an individual study is never the final word. Actually, nothing is the final word, but you look at an individual study. So, but the point is, like, when you start putting them together, what does the puzzle say? Put the pieces together. And that's when we get meta-analyses and systematic reviews and consensus reports and so on. Those are more reliable because experts, people who understand the literature in those areas, are able to put together the pieces and come to the most reliable conclusion. The stronger that evidence is, then the stronger the consensus. Very strongly supported theories and laws are very unlikely to change significantly. And so everything is tentative, but not equally tentative. If we're talking about a new area where we don't know a lot, I think it's important for those of us who aren't experts in certain fields to be able to recognize that, the experts are actually working this out still. Like, the evidence is not really there to come to a strong conclusion. If the evidence changes, it's okay to change our mind. Actually, that's a good thing. Changing your mind with evidence is awesome,
Right.
but still
That's
recognizing that
the famous Keynes quotation. I changed my mind when the evidence changed. What would you do, sir?
yes, yes. And also recognizing, like, not all knowledge is equally certain. If it's a new thing with new evidence, we're not very certain yet. As opposed to something like anthropogenic climate change or evolutionary theory, we're very certain.
Right. Okay. So I want to. You mentioned a couple of times here how certain issues or certain areas of knowledge become politicized, and I want to delve into that. Now, let's take climate change. Um, all scientists, there's a consensus among climate scientists that climate change is real. It's caused by humans. fine. Now, to my mind, a natural political response to that is, well, what do we do about it? Do we cut emissions? Do we take carbon out of the atmosphere? Do we say, it doesn't matter, we're going to focus our efforts on dealing with a warmer climate, but we don't want to, we've already emitted all the carbon, and so let's make our societies more resilient to a warmer Earth. That's an inherently political question of how do we address the fact that that the Earth is warming due to our own activities. But when we say politicization, that's not what we mean, the political response to a given fact. When we say that climate change has become politicized, what we mean is that certain political parties or certain political affiliations think that, agree with the scientific consensus that there is climate change and that it's a fairly urgent problem and we need to do something about it. And other political identities deny the very existence of climate change as something meaningful. Or if the Earth is warming, some will concede, not all, that it's not human caused anyway. It's because of solar flares or some other excuse that is much larger than humanity. So there's not much that we can do about it. My question to you is, it's in two parts. I always have too many questions, but it's in two parts. How does an issue, particularly scientific, although it needn't be strictly scientific, how does an issue become politicized? And again, I mean in the sense of like whether it exists or not in what an appropriate response would be. And once it has been politicized, what can we do to bring folks that have adopted that political identity and perhaps internalized that perspective on the issue back to something closer to reality, or at least our best understanding of what reality is?
Yeah, that is a really good question, and the way that you phrase it, I think, is part of the problem for most people, in that the science tells us what we know, and politics tells us what to do about it. Or politics is our process of deciding, well, what do we do with this knowledge? And I think for a lot of us, those things are confused. We equate the two. So, Naomi Oreskes has done some really wonderful work in the area of documenting the tobacco strategy that we just talked about,
Mm-hmm.
the how the tobacco industry was able to sow enough doubt to try to convince people that we didn't know enough about the health impacts of their products to regulate. Now, there's a
Right.
lot
They
in
weren't
that.
trying to convince anybody of anything. They only fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Nobody knows anything was their goal.
Yes, the goal of disinformation campaigns is not necessarily to convince us that experts are wrong or that this thing is true. It's to just sow enough doubt that we go, I don't know, we don't know enough. We don't need to do anything.
Right.
But that was motivated by a solution aversion. So, solution aversion is I don't like the solution to a problem, therefore, I'm going to deny the problem. If the solution to a problem is government regulation of my products, I don't like that solution. So I'm going to convince people that the problem isn't real. Now, that tobacco strategy was also used often by the same think tanks and the same scientists, I'm air quoting again, to promote doubt, to sow doubt about what we knew about the causes and existence of climate change so that we didn't regulate. Now, built in there, though, is inherently something that is anti government, in that this was largely coming out of communism, the fight against communism. And scientists who had the worldview and industry that had the worldview that government regulation was communism promoted this. Now, for people then who, like, for example, if I'm a conservative and I don't like the idea of government being involved in things, then it's easier to deny the problem than it is to recognize the problem and try to solve it. Actually, this is ironic because what happens is the problem is real and denying the problem does not make it go away, but it does reduce your ability to have some sort of say in what the solution is. Now, that said, at this point, the denial of certain things, like the denial of climate change, evolution denial in particular, are so ingrained into an identity, a conservative identity, that I don't know how to solve that problem, because and I don't think most people even realize where it came from, or that it was based on this idea of being anti-government regulation. It just is who I am as a conservative, is that I don't think climate change is real. I wish I knew what to do about that. I don't have an answer to that part of your question.
Okay.
uh, yeah, it is really hard. Although I will say it is important to recognize that we're all prone to this. All of us are prone to denying problems, falling for misinformation. And so, yeah, other than the empathy piece and letting people be wrong and change their minds, I don't know what to do.
Right. So that is, it is a challenge. So what? So let's, we've talked a lot about, we, others, but like what? How can I learn about my blind spots, or can you tell me about a time when uh, you learned something new? You encountered a fact, or at least a claim. You weren't willing, perhaps you weren't willing to accept it as a fact at first, that countered one of your cherished or deeply held beliefs, and how you did that. I think it might be instructive, because part of the definition of a blind spot is that you're not aware that you're blind in that area. So I'm sure I have them, but I don't know where. And maybe can you share how you had to change your mind about something that you thought you were right about, but you weren't?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And part of the irony is that there's something called belief change blindness, where we do change our beliefs, but we don't remember believing another way. We just rewrite our memory to thinking that
I've
we always.
always been in favor of gay marriage.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So there is that. Now, there are things that I have, like major worldview shifts. Like I grew up in a young Earth creationist church. Um,
Okay, so as a biologist, yeah, you've definitely come a long way from there.
Definitely, definitely. And then after I left that, I went through a phase of like kind of the, for lack of a better word, crunchy stuff. So like GMOs were bad, and everything, like natural medications were better, and all that kind of thing. So, but again, looking back, those beliefs were part of a larger worldview, and the entire worldview had to shift to change those individual beliefs. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
I'll tell you a funnier, smaller example.
Sure.
So, my husband and I really like to play cards. There's this card game that we play called golf. It's really easy to play. It's 9 hands, like golf, and I hate to lose. And so, like every time we start to play this game, I'm like, "Oh my god, you're gonna beat me again!" Right? I start to pout right away. Like I lose all the time. I don't want to lose again, but fine, I suppose you're just going to beat me. He's like, "What are you talking about? You win all the time." No, I don't. Right? So we're fighting over this. Now, the interesting part here is that he's actually been keeping score. So we actually know overall how many games we played. And I think at this point, it's like I'm up like 90 some games to his 50 some games.
Oh wow. So yeah, you win like one more than one and a half, not quite twice as many games.
I do win most of the time, right? And so, but I only know I'm wrong because he's been keeping score.
Right.
And right, it's basic confirmation bias. Like I don't like to lose. I remember losing. I don't remember winning. And so every time it comes up, and the only reason I know that my belief is wrong is because he's been keeping score. We don't have the value of doing that for most of our
He
beliefs.
fudged the numbers. That guy fudged the number. He just wrote down that you won 90 times to make you feel better.
You know what? This sounds exactly like what I start to do when he tells me these numbers. And then I'll say, well, but you won the last game. No, actually, you did. Well, you won the one before. Well, okay, yes, I won that one. You won it by a lot, didn't you? So it's this motivated reasoning process to support the belief that I just think is true, which is I lose a lot. Anyway, so he is right about that, but I wouldn't believe him. I don't think I'd believe him if he didn't keep score. So again, there's the thing, like in real life, we don't have the option to do that, but we should realize that we might not remember and things the way that they happened.
Okay. Well, that's
I'm really a sore loser. I do have to tell
well, yeah, no, I remember reading that there's like it's a basic human tendency of loss aversion. Like we're willing to forego $2 of potential gain in order to ensure that we don't lose 50 cents, because losing that 50 cents is so painful that fine, don't give me the $5 or $2 later on. I just don't take those 50 cents away from me. And we're not rational about things. We don't treat potential gains the same way as potential losses. We have loss aversion bias, and that I read that. I was like, oh, that's silly. Like I have a degree in mathematics. It's like, oh, that's really silly. Like I'm reading about it on a paper. Like, oh no, just go for the expected value and maximize your gains. And then I was in a situation where I was like, no, don't take it away from me. I was like,
you.
maybe there's something to this.
Well, and to take that a step further and take it back to the tribalism, we're actually willing to take less for ourselves if it means that the difference between us and the other team, the other tribe is greater.
Mhm.
Right? We really want our side to win.
Right. And in a way, that's a form of altruism. Like we're willing to sacrifice personal gain for the benefit of us, or to incur a greater cost on them. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Like,
so like what they've what they'll do is they'll give people an option. The original person who did this was Henri Tajfel, and he was this was post World War, and he was a Jew. He was trying to figure out how people could do this, and so what he did was he was trying to establish at what level will people other. And so he set up base conditions. He started with dots on a screen. So he would flash dots, for example, and then ask you to estimate how many dots were on a screen. And then he would put you into a group of overestimators or underestimators.
like the group would be plants. They're confederates of the experimenter.
No, so what you would do is like if there was dots on the screen and there was actually 100 dots, but I said 150,
Yeah.
he would put me in the group of overestimators.
Oh, I see. Okay. Other people that just happen to overestimate as well. Okay.
But actually, he randomly put people in those two groups. They
Okay.
weren't actually overestimators or underestimators. So what he was trying to do at this very basic step was figure out, okay, minimal group paradigm, what is the base level people will start to discriminate against the other? And then he found when, even with that level, that people would take less in winnings for themselves if it meant that the other team got even less. They wanted a bigger difference in the two
Ah.
groups.
Okay.
But what he was trying to do was establish a base condition, and then he was going to add conditions to see at what level people would start to discriminate against the other side. And he didn't make it that far. It was literally base level. So
Okay.
we will discriminate against the other
For the
side.
most trivial of differences.
Yes,
Ooh,
I
that's
know.
ouch.
Indeed.
Think findings like that make me amazed that we have survived as a species as long as we have, but we've made it this far.
Well, we certainly aren't adapted. Our brains are not adapted to the kinds of environments that they're in. To me, this really highlights, to circle back to like what is critical thinking. To me, critical thinking is an awareness of what your brain is up to when you don't realize what it's doing, and it's doing things like that. It
Hmm.
will instantaneously, without your thought, other people, right? It will self serve. It uses its emotions to come to conclusions and then convince you that you are absolutely right and give you a level of certainty that it is so hard to change your mind, right? You're convinced that you're right. And so to me, our brains are doing these things without our awareness. And we don't generally teach people what our brains are up to, but it's really important information because we've got these like Stone Age brains, and now we're on like, social media. And is it any wonder that we are fighting over the kinds of things that we're fighting over? And so the only answer I have is to help people understand that you have to be taught to be in control of your brain. If you want to make better decisions, you need to be aware of what your brain is doing and be able to find better information so that you can make better decisions.
Right, and hence the name of your website, Thinking is Power.
Yeah, the idea there was, knowledge is power, but there is just too much to know, and we carry access to all of it in our pockets. But there's also lots of misinformation in there. So the better question is, when you need reliable information, can you find it and think about it in a way that helps you make better decisions? And it really does start with us. That's, to me, that is the empowerment part, is being in control of your thinking, not letting it go on autopilot and lead you astray.
Melanie, I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours, and I certainly would like to, because I've learned a lot and have so much more I want to ask and explore with you. But I also want to respect your time and that of our listeners. So I'm going to say thank you. And do you have any last thoughts that you want to share with the listeners of Podcast for Inquiry?
Well, I've really enjoyed this, and you ask amazing questions. And so I have really appreciated this and your time. So thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you again. If you enjoyed today's episode, please show your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry and give us a 5-star review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter or X at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.